When the history department at Louisiana University asked me to deliver the Walter Linwood Fleming Lectures in 2004, I focused on pesticides. As I plunged back into archives research, I read a 1960 telegram that tingled my skeptical nerve. It was from the head of the Delta Council, an organization of Mississippi planters, asking for expert testimony from a scientist at the Mississippi Experiment Station in a case alleging pesticide poisoning. The telegram warned that, quote, outcome of case could have influence on cotton insect control program in future years. Curious, I followed the trail that led me to the Library of Congress Law Library again, where I found the case, Lawler v. Skelton. The case had gone to the Mississippi Supreme Court, which had reversed the jury verdict. The Supreme Court decision indicated perjury, a physician erroneously not allowed to continue her testimony, misinformation from expert witnesses, and other flaws that led to the reversal. More curious, I went to Jackson and read the 3-volume trial transcript. Later, I found the plaintiff's lawyer's records in Drew, Mississippi, and interviewed several people connected with the case. Lawler v. Skelton was extremely important and complex and attracted the interest not only of the Delta Council, but also of the Farm Bureau Federation. Nationally prominent expert witnesses traveled to Indianola to dismiss the toxicity of pesticides. Yet the case generated no press coverage, for planters wanted to mute any discussion of pesticide toxicity. Research on toxic chemicals ultimately evolved into the book Toxic Drift, an expanded version of the Fleming Lectures. Despite rich sources, I had failed to discover personal information on Charles Lawler, the man who was poisoned. The trial transcript indicated that he managed a cotton gin near Indianola, Mississippi, and in 1956, a crop duster sprayed him with a mixture of malathion and endrin plus some solvents. He was kneeling down welding when the plane swept by the gin and the pilot turned on the nozzles, and the chemical cloud hit the cement slab and bounced back under his welding mask. He choked, almost passed out, went home, was nauseous, and the next day went into a coma. The doctor treated him with atropine, the antidote for organophosphate poisoning, but on the witness stand testified that he thought Lawler's complaint was due to a heart condition. Lawler survived, but his health was broken, and he lost his job and was ill the remainder of his life. In 1960, he sued the landlord, tenant, and owner of the plane and lost. But as I mentioned, the Mississippi Supreme Court reversed the jury verdict. Unfortunately, there was no second trial, either because Lawler was in such poor health or that the African-American witness could not be located. I could never find out how long Lawler had lived or what happened to his family, despite calling people named Lawler in East Arkansas, Mississippi, and West Tennessee. I drove down to Baton Rouge in the spring of 2004 for the lectures, stopping off in Memphis to dine and spend the night with my friend Jim Lanier. That afternoon, we drove by the Velsicol chemical plant, whose endrin runoff in the early 1960s had poisoned millions of fish in the Mississippi River, not to mention poisoning the whole surrounding community. I took some photographs. David and Angela Less came to the dinner that evening. David, an ethnomusicologist, worked closely with me on the Rock and Soul exhibit that had opened in Memphis in 2000. As we chatted over dinner, Angela, who's from Arkansas, began, not uncharacteristically, to talk about family. Their daughter, Emma McGuire Less, was almost named Emma Lawler Less. I felt this blush, and I interrupted Angela and said, Angela, the main person in this talk I'm giving at LSU was Charles Lawler. He was poisoned. And she said, Uncle Charlie, he was poisoned. He was on oxygen the rest of his life. So I drove down to Baton Rouge having the answer to these questions that I hadn't had before. My latest book, Dispossession, reveals encompassing USDA discrimination aimed primarily at African American farmers, but also at women, Indians, Hispanics, at all small farmers. Most of the documentation for this book was right here. Joe Schwartz called my attention to a record group 16 civil rights entry, and later he found 1,140 uncatalogued boxes of ASCS records. Yeah, that's the good news and the bad news. One of the most significant aspects of researching and writing Dispossession was discovering the role of people who had not previously been recognized by historians. It fascinated me that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, inspired not only other protest movements of the 1960s, but also some of the first statements on the women's movement. Willie Strain took on the Extension Service and set the precedent for other suits regarding discrimination. The 1999 Pigford v. Glickman decision dealt with discrimination since 1981, when the Reagan administration's USDA Office of Civil Rights stopped investigating complaints. It also suggested to women, Indians, and Hispanics a means to seek redress from the USDA's discrimination. These significant historical contributions have had little historical scrutiny, and in Dispossession, I attempted to call attention not only to USDA discrimination, but also to the unheralded people who fought back. But history is no B-Western. No hero has ridden down the halls of the USDA and driven out the rustlers, and there is no tombstone marking the final resting place of discrimination. Thank you. We probably have time for some questions. How's our time doing? Yeah, if we have time for questions, if you'd like to ask some. Well, I'm not going to give an encore. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, you made reference to changes at the Smithsonian, especially with regard to sponsorship. Can you expand more on that?
I'm glad you asked that question. I could go on all day on this subject, but over the years, the Smithsonian has not been open to doing exhibits that contained any controversy, which means you're not doing exhibits that mean anything. Historians constantly reinterpret the historical past just the same way scientists are continually learning things about their discipline. And to exclude the things that we're learning that reinterpret what we knew should be in the National Museum. I mean, I felt so frustrated the last years I worked there because you have so much potential to do really meaningful exhibits, and that was not being realized. That's why I think I take so much pride in the science exhibit, because we really fought hard to preserve the integrity of that exhibit. And in the end, we got good advice from scientists and historians of science, and a lot of good people gave us good advice. But we held the line that history, it has to be history. It's not going to be a trade show. I could go on and on, but I'll leave it there. There's a real problem there with happy endings. And like I said, it's more like a B-Western.
Hey, did you come up with any kind of guidelines that would be useful for other organizations encountering the same problem with trade show exhibits?
This organization, the Society for History and the Federal Government, put forth guidelines. How many years ago? I forget. A while back. They perfectly answer those needs. It tells exactly how exhibits should be done, how you should make sure they're historically accurate, and so forth. And that was one of the great contributions of this society, is setting up those guidelines. Mark.
Peter, actually, USDA or other agencies are thinking about what they're keeping. And what challenges, does NAR and federal authorities in terms of make sure that these records are in fact there? Do you see any sensitivity, I guess is the question, among the officials about the kind of spotlight you've been turning on what they do wrong?
Federal records are so voluminous that it would be very difficult to see any intention, because they get filed and put in files and then they get transferred here. There are some memos to the record. Occasionally you'll run into, Orville Freeman would write a memo to the record. Didn't go out anywhere, it was just his thoughts on what was going on. And he had some unkind things to say about Jamie Whitten, the congressman from Mississippi. So occasionally you'll run into something like that. But there was an African-American man who worked in the Department of Agriculture in the 60s, William Seabrun. And when I found out he had papers at Wayne State, at the Reuther Library, I was so excited, because you didn't get this clear picture of him doing his bureaucratic job. So I went there, and it was nothing but invitations and announcements. There was no letter to his children saying what was going on. I knew what was going on. And it was so frustrating, because he didn't, for some reason, want to tell what happened. And Orville Freeman, in his oral history interviews, never mentions black people, except maybe some superficial mention. But when you read the civil rights boxes in Record Group 16, which William Seabrun was pretty much the central character in that, there's enough in there to tell the story. It's just plenty of material to enlighten what was really going on and how Seabrun was set up. Here's a man who was trying to do the right thing. His memos were intercepted before they could get to Freeman. When something didn't work out, it was always his fault. So he was taking all the blame for the discrimination that went on in the department, although he was trying to fight it. So you have to figure things out. Some things you read, I would think is an outright lie, and that's just what we get paid big money for, is figuring that out as historians. You analyze things, and of course you have a lot of information that you read and evaluate, and after a while it starts making sense to you that this is probably correct and this probably isn't. Okay, thank you.